Welcome to you all. Welcome to those who are listening to this on catch up as well, because I'm recording it for those who can't make it tonight. It's quite a good evening to kind of be talking about the Great War. It's the 31st of October, and 110 years ago tonight, the first Battle of Ypres was well in swing, and the London Scottish on Halloween 1914 fought that famous action around Messines. And we are going to make reference to the London Scottish in this talk tonight, not about Messines, not about the first Battle of Ypres, but about the Loos Battlefield that's sandwiched in that area of the so-called Forgotten Front between Flanders, between places like Messines and that more popularly visited area to the south around Arras and the Somme, but nevertheless a really important part of the British sector of the Western Front. In fact, 110 years ago, this, of course, was a French sector, and the ground that would be fought over in 1915 was at that stage behind the German lines because the French battles of 1914-15 in this area were kind of undergoing or not yet taken place, and they would be the ones that would push the Germans back through villages like Vermelles, for example, and the new line be established that the British took over in the summer of 1915. And it's a very different landscape to some of the others on the British part of the Western Front, which this first image kind of portrays this vast open landscape with dominated by what was once the local industry, the coal mining industry, with that massive twin slag heap of the double Crassier, but the kind of lifting gear from other mines visible not far away on this landscape. But the vast openness is something that is very different, even to the big open fields of the Somme and the rolling chalk land around Arras and Cambrai. And it is much more of an industrialized landscape because of the coal mining. Some might say it's a boring landscape, but I find it a fascinating part of the Western Front, and certainly I hope to share a little bit of that fascination with you this evening. So we're not hoping to cover the whole Battle of Loos or every part of the Loos battlefield. There is a podcast episode called Loos in a Day, which kind of gives you a heads up as to how to visit this place. But I thought we'd go over some of the key kind of locations and talk about one or two little stories as well. And it's always good to start with some maps. So we've got a kind of an overall map of the Loos battlefield, looking at where the British advanced on the 25th of September 1915. This was not a standalone operation. It was part of a joint offensive with the French, as the British would attack here at Loos on the 25th of September. Then the French would also attack at Souchez and Hill 145 in the area that we'd call Vimy Ridge. And then further down the Western Front, they'd be attacking in the Champagne. And Alex, who you know as 315th Regiment of Infantry on Twitter, together with the late, great Dave O'Mara, has done a lot of work on that particular day and how it affected the French in terms of casualties. And it was a deadly day. It was certainly one of the deadliest days on the Western Front through all 4 years of the First World War. And the intention with these joint attacks was to break through here, northern France, break through in another part of northern France near Arras, and advance through the German territory across the Douai plain up towards Lille, and meanwhile down in the Champagne they'd break through there. And I kind of think, like a lot of battles and a lot of wars, in a lot of conflicts, they hadn't always thought about what they would do next. So if those three great penetrations of the German line had succeeded, how would they actually have come together to achieve some kind of victory on a bigger scale? I'm not sure that they'd really properly considered that. But in terms of the British experience of the Battle of Loos, this is a part of the line that we've only recently taken over, the British from the French. And in 1915, as the size of the British Army grows on the Western Front, with the arrival of more territorial divisions, but also more importantly, the first wave of men from Kitchener's army, the new army, the so-called first 100,000, and they are the first 100,000 volunteers who had joined in 1914, had been trained now, put into formations, and were now ready to come across to the Western Front. And many of those divisions, of which the 9th Scottish Division is the very first unit of Kitchener's army to be formed as part of the first 100,000 is very much involved in this battle. And in many ways, it is very much a Scottish battle because so many Scottish units take part in it, with the 9th Scottish Division, but also the 15th Scottish Division going over the top that day, but many other Scottish regiments in some of the other formations that were there. It's, for the British, a different battle. In previously, 1915 had been a year of offensives, from the Battle of Neuve Chapelle in March through to Albers Ridge and the fighting around Festubert and Givenchy. That had been in the kind of flat wetlands of the very northern part of France, close to the border with Flanders, often called French Flanders. But this was a chalk landscape, a flat and open chalk landscape, with a lot of industrialized villages and towns scattered in and around it. For the British, quite important, fed by a main railhead at Bethune, and with good roads potentially to bring up troops towards the front line. And what the British essentially inherited here was a whole system of trenches where the French had been fighting in 1915. As we mentioned, they had advanced between the La Bassée Canal, which was previously the dividing line largely between the British sector of the Western Front and the French one in the north. They advanced in that area, and they'd taken some of the ground in what became the northern part of the Loos battlefield, taken the village of Vermelles, pushed the line forwards towards Loos itself, and that's what the British Army had inherited. And this was chosen as potential offensive ground for an attack as part of this big joint offensive of September of 1915. And when we look at it, in a battle, you want to send your troops forward into ground that you know you can take and that you can hold, and that the movement of particularly large bodies of troops does require some degree of cover occasionally. This landscape has virtually no cover, as we'll talk about and discuss through some of the images. It is very open. There's no woodlands like there are on the Somme here. There's no valleys to hide your troops in or move them up unseen by the enemy. Once they're out of their trenches and in the open, that's pretty much it. And that's fine as long as your barrage has done its work. And 1915 had been a year where artillery had been plagued by the shell scandal, the inability to produce enough artillery shells to be fired by the guns. But this was different now, with the change in the way that the government ruled and dictated what happened in the munitions factories and the production of shells being at an all-time high. This seemed that with the guns and the artillery and the shells, more importantly, the shells now available to launch this attack, then potentially there would be quite a lot of destruction of the German positions, and there could be some success. And the commander-in-chief at this phase of the war, it's always worth remembering, is still Sir John French, who has commanded the British Army since the beginning of the war. And this is Sir John French's big push. There's a book by Patrick McGill, who served in the London Irish Rifles in this battle, called The Big Push. And that was the phrase that the Tommies, the soldiers on the ground, used for this battle. It's a phrase that we kind of think probably more associate with the Battle of the Somme. But I guess there were many big pushes in the eyes of British soldiers on the Western Front in that middle part of the First World War. So a big open landscape dominated by these coal mining features. To the south, particularly around Loos, there were the signs of these slag heaps, but at the area near to Auchy-les-Mines was an area, Pithead, that had one of the biggest German redoubts on the Western Front built around it, which was the Hohenzollern Redoubt, Hohenzollern being the name of the German royal family. That's how the redoubt gets its name. Behind that, a big slag heap at Fossate and the Dump. And then to the south around Loos, you had the double Crassier towards Maroc itself, and then some rising ground beyond Loos village. Loos sat in a bit of a dip, and beyond it was rising ground onto what's on a contoured hill with the number 70 on it, so it became Hill 70. And that was close to the nearby city of Lens or Lens, which was the dominant town in this coal mining landscape of northern France. So that's the kind of battlefield in terms of a bit of map and a bit of background. When we start to look at images of it, and this is an image that's from the history of the 47th London Division, who fought to the south. And I think it also appears in the history of the 12th Eastern Division, who came in later on in the battle. And it's taken from near to Vermelles, looking out across towards the Hohenzollern Redoubt, this big defensive position that the Germans had. And it gives us a typical kind of view of what the landscape at Loos in 1915 was like, flat. We can see some of the embankment there is a railway embankment that's part of the coal mining features that's there. There's the shadow of some of the slag heaps in the distance and some of the buildings of the coal mines and the villages. We can see the evidence of the chalk, the trenches dug into this landscape, throwing up chalk spoil. And we can see quite clearly, apart from a few isolated little trees along a road, and this is a road, if I remember correctly, that comes off of the Bethune-Labassé road down towards Vermelles village, where there was quite a lot of mine craters in this area, but the only kind of cover are these isolated little trees, which are really no cover at all. And we can see very much the open nature of this battlefield. And then if we look at these images to the south, that again come from some units histories that give us a kind of bit of an idea of what the landscape of Loos was like. This is also a period from a photographic point of view. It's a period in which we see still no official photographers working with the BEF. There are private photographers. Cameras are largely still alive, private cameras allowed. And there were press photographers at Loos. So we rely on a lot of private images or engineering images, of which these are part of, that would have taken panoramics of the battlefield for intelligence purposes. We rely on that kind of imagery of Loos compared to, what we have, the bountiful amount of imagery we have for the next big push when there were official photographers, which of course is the Battle of the Somme. And what we see here again is an indication of this landscape being open. We can see some of these tree-lined roads, and it's amazing that when the British took over this sector, this is what they saw. The French had been fighting here, there'd been bombardments, but yet these tree-lined avenues were still there, and structures like Tower Bridge, which we see to the left of this image, which was a big bit of lifting gear at a pit head, which looked like Tower Bridge in London. That's how it got its name. That could be seen from pretty much all of the British trenches, the top part of it, and could be seen from balloons, observation balloons, and obviously from the planes of the Royal Flying Corps and so on. It became a major landmark on the battlefield. And then to the south, we've got the slag heaps of the double Crassier, which was the rough spoil, the slag from the mines thrown up, very much part of this kind of coal mining industrial landscape, not just in northern France, but all over the place. When I lived in South Yorkshire, this is stuff that's kind of hidden by trees now, as they've attempted to do in northern France, but it is very much kind of part of that inherent landscape where coal mining takes place. And there's a whole nother talk really about what is beneath this landscape, which are the tunnels that were used by both sides, begun by miners, used by soldiers, expanded upon. And there are groups that have explored them. I remember many, many years ago talking to Rose Coombs, who wrote Before Endeavours Fade, her of the Imperial War Museum, great knowledge of the First World War. And I can't remember how she got down, but she got into one set of the tunnels near Vermelles through one of her local contacts, and had actually found her father's name on the wall of the chalk tunnels down there. It's something that I wish I'd have had much more time to have kind of spoken to her about her more, really. And sadly, she never left any kind of written account of that. So this gives us an idea of the kind of contrast between the open fields around places like the Hohenzollern Redoubt and here with the kind of industrial landscape closer to the coal mines. And sticking with Tower Bridge, because it is such an important structure, it was a huge piece of machinery with these two big wheels that lifted the cages that brought the miners from deep underground up to ground level. It had this huge long slag heap behind it that also had a railway line on it that could bring the coal directly out of the mines, probably from conveyors and all that kind of stuff that's in there. But it was this kind of characteristic piece of the landscape that many soldiers remembered. and the postcard on the left-hand side, which is a contemporary postcard that was sold to soldiers in places like Bethune, because local photographers had photographed this before the war, because I think it was one of the biggest bits of lifting gear in that part of northern France. Probably thinking that who would ever buy a postcard of this? But yeah, it becomes part of that battlefield landscape, and it means a lot to the British soldiers who are there in 1915, and it's sold in great numbers in places like Bethune behind the lines. And there are some great kind of descriptions of it. I often talk about Henry Williamson. He was certainly in France in 1915. I'm never entirely convinced whether he was actually in the Battle of Loos, but he certainly wrote about it extensively in his Chronicle of Ancient Sunlight, which I know quite a lot of you have read. His book, A Fox Under My Cloak, um, has got it on the cover, I believe, if I remember correctly. But he talks about going up to the top of this. Philip, the character in it, goes up there, and it's an observation post. And we do know from artillery diaries that gunner officers went forward once the 15th Scottish Division took the village of Loos, and did use it as an OP because they had perfect views right over to Lens, right across Hill 70, and it was a way of obviously directing the fire of your guns. That whole movement forward with artillery, this was at one of those moments in the war in which that went through quite a big shift, I think, in the way that gunner officers liaised with men on the ground and artillery reacted to situations on the battlefield. You've got to remember that only a year before, at the time of the Battle of the Marne, and just before it, Le Cateau, then guns were there, field guns were there to fire over open sites to support infantry on the ground. And now you were using artillery indirectly to assist units to capture ground and then defend them once they'd taken it. So it was a big shift in the use of artillery, which I'm sure will come when we finally get around to doing a proper podcast on the war of the guns. But Tower Bridge, really important bit of the landscape, and it survived the first day, and it pretty much survived the whole battle in 1915. It was damaged, the Germans shelled it, it got hit, and I suspect it became increasingly a very dangerous place to go up to do any kind of spotting. But it survived pretty much for most of the war, although it got in a worse and worse state. But by 1918, there was almost nothing of it left, and it was demolished but rebuilt. And I often wondered what it looked like. And John Giles, the founder of the Western Front Association, gave me this photograph that he took in the 1960s, not long, possibly early 70s, not long before that particular coal mine was decommissioned. And this shows the replacement Tower Bridge, not as grand, not as kind of powerful in the way that it looks, with twin lifting gear, but a mere shadow of the Tower Bridge that had been there in that period before the First World War. Now there's no trace of even this building whatsoever. And the embankment that the made of the slag where the railway came in, that is now a walkway that will take you round to one of the entrances to the new Loos British extension, and is very close to the Hill 70 Canadian Memorial Park. But they're making quite a lot of this and of this part of the battlefield now, which is really, really good to see. Now, I mentioned, promised we'd have mention of the London Scottish, and here they are. I mean, one of the ways I could do this talk is to go through private images from my collection. I've kind of always been drawn to Loos and those battlefields in 1915, and I have quite a few related images. And this is one of those little collections that almost certainly came from one of those immortal junk shops in the south of England sometime in the 1980s. I remember buying this and a couple of portraits of a London Scottish soldier. This is mounted on card. It's taken at Bethune sometime in 1915. I don't know whether before or just after the battle. As you may know through listening to the podcast, I knew several veterans of the London Scottish, but one in particular, Harry Coates, who fought at Loos with the London Jocks. He became a particularly good friend as well as veteran friend. And I remember taking this to show him. And I mean, this was then 70 years after the Battle of Loos, but he kind of scanned the faces, and there was a couple that he recognized, but he couldn't remember what their actual names were. He knew them as Chalky White or something like that, not rather than really who they actually were. He didn't recognize the officer that's on there. But nevertheless, these are men who have either just experienced the Battle of Loos or are about to. And considering it's 31st of October and a significant day for the history of the regiment, it's good to have this kind of photograph in there as well. And I think these images taken on active service, either just before or during a battle, I think give us a really fantastic, fascinating insight into the faces of these men who took part in these battles, and who knows what stories these guys could tell. But following on that theme, again, you can kind of pick up an image, and back in those days, images were so cheap. We're talking kind of tens of pence, if that, sometimes. And again, I remember picking up this one in Brighton Market once, so they just sitting there. I could see it was some soldiers. And the two guys at the front are holding kit bags, which have got their names on and their regimental numbers and their unit, more importantly, which is 10th Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment. And this is them in training in 1914. It's fairly early on. They're part of that first 100,000. And you can see in the background, there's a mixture of uniforms, some khaki service dress, some Kitchener's blues, the kind of blue serge tunics and the little forage caps rather than the service dress caps. There's a mixture of types of caps. Some men have got shoulder titles as cap badges instead of actual cap badges of the Gloucestershire Regiment. And I'm sure that wasn't, instead of a rifle, one of them's got an umbrella there. He's shouldering arms with an umbrella rather than a rifle, which I'm sure wasn't actually what was given to him instead of his rifle. But it kind of, I have a feeling that it's kind of a nod, maybe a bit of a dig at the fact that they were so ill equipped at this stage of the conflict and they didn't have all the kit that they needed. This battalion and these men and those two holding their kit bags would be both wounded on the 25th of September 1915, would be very much at the vanguard of the attack at the Lone Tree near to Le Routoir Farm at Loos. And that's a place that we'll visit on our little virtual tour. So again, I love the way that images like this can connect you to an actual place on the landscape of the Western Front of the First World War battlefields. There we go. And then in terms of kind of individual images, the one on the left I've tweeted a lot over the years, and that came out of a junk shop in Reading. It used to be a really fantastic little junk shop there that always had good postcards in it. And I was kind of, and they weren't in any kind of order. They're just everything from kind of pictures of Brighton Pier through to First World War stuff. And I saw this, and normally I would have just gone straight past that, but what I saw was what was written in ink at the top of it, which says "Return from France after battle," and it continues underneath "of Loos, September the 25th, 1915." So this is a picture of a young girl. I call the young girl of Loos. And on the back of it, it's a Reading photographer. So I bought it in Reading. It's a Reading photographer. The Royal Berkshire Regiment was very much involved in the Battle of Loos and had battalions that went over the top on the 25th of September, again near to the Lone Tree and that advance towards Hullock. And I had a look at the newspapers of the time when I lived in Reading, because I lived there for a little while. And there were lots of references to these images like this, pictures of children, pictures of women fluttering across the battlefield where men had gone over and they'd come out their pockets, blown out their pockets, they'd dropped them for whatever reason. I mean, who knows the circumstances, but there were these very poignant accounts of soldiers after the battle had moved on a bit, going around picking up images like this and sending them back to the local newspaper to say, who is this? Is this someone's son? Is this someone's daughter? Is this someone's wife, mother, whatever, sister, whatever it is? And I've never, ever been able to identify who she was. So I guess, something that I often say in the podcast about how the women of that generation were as much casualties of the Great War as the men who were commemorated in the cemeteries and the memorials and the war memorials right across Britain. I hope that her dad came home, but there's a fair chance that he didn't. And whether he did or didn't, she still is. She lived in the kind of shadow of the First World War and her father's experiences. She's as much a casualty of that war as those lads were themselves, who were actually there on the ground. So it's a fantastic piece of social history, that really. And favourite's probably the wrong word, but it's certainly for me, one of my most kind of impressionable postcards that I own, considering what it stands for, really. And on the right, that rather old soldier, Colonel Vansittart of the 8th Royal West Kents from a little collection of cards I picked up of British prisoners of war, which I think I might even have found in Germany on a trip there once. And they're all from a German prisoner of war camp, and there's a lot of Royal Flying Corps officers and some very early war regular officers in these pictures. But Colonel Vansittart was also part of the first 100,000. He commanded the 8th Battalion, the Royal West Kents, which is a new army battalion. First time in action, first time over the bags, not on the first day, but they went into action on the 26th, and they moved into that bit of ground. They went up over the ground that had been captured in the early phase of the battle, into the ground between Hullock and some of the slag heaps in that area and Hill 70. And this was an area that became an absolute killing ground to two particular divisions, the 21st and the 24th divisions, who suffered absolutely staggering casualties there because the Germans had a curved position which followed the contours of the high ground that overlooked this, what was essentially a kind of valley, with a whole series of what were called Stützpunkts on their map, strong points, an early word, German word for strong point, with interlocking fields of fire. And they could put Maxim guns in there, German Maxims, and lay down heavy fire into that open ground. And they chewed up unit after unit after unit, leading to many of these units losing all of their officers. And Vansittart was wounded and captured, one of several battalion commanders to become casualties that day. And these units fall back in a kind of disarray, leading to the idea that they'd run away in battle, and that kind of besmirchment of their reputation hanging around for quite a long time afterwards. And again, it's amazing really what you can do with just one image with a name on it that links you to a battalion and a day and an action and a wider story of the First World War. And of course, we could talk about even more famous characters of the Battle of Loos. And I know at least one of you will be pleased that we've included Piper Daniel Laidlaw, that famous piper of the 7th Battalion King's Own Scottish Borderers, who went over the top in the 15th Scottish Division attack on the slopes that lead up to where Dud Corner Cemetery is today. You had two roads that ran there, the main road, the Lens Road, and then a minor road called the Loos Road that ran directly into Loos village. And they both had redoubts on them, the Loos Road Redoubt and the Lens Road Redoubt. And the 15th Scottish Division went over the top, and they used a lot of smoke there that confused their own troops. So at one point, battalions lost direction and they were running parallel to the German front line and got fire into their flanks, enfilade fire, and there were a lot of casualties, and the attack faltered a little bit. And men like Laidlaw, and in particular Laidlaw, went forward and he piped the men to build up their spirits, to give them hope, to lead them forward. And for that, and numerous other acts of bravery in that opening stage of the Battle of Loos, he became one of the men to be awarded the Victoria Cross. Some of the contemporary accounts talk about him actually being killed. Such was the severity of his wounds, but he survived. And he became quite a well-known individual as a consequence of it. I mean, these are just the paintings, the illustrations we can see on here are just two of many that were done at the time. And there's a fantastic book called The Pipes of War, which is a huge volume, about 3 or 4 inches thick, which kind of gives a history of pipers in the Great War. I think the digital version of it is available online now, but it kind of gives an insight just to how important these pipers were in Scottish regiments, and not just Scottish regiments. Quite a number of other units, including battalions of the British Army, had pipe bands, including, for example, 16th Battalion Middlesex Regiment, the public schools battalion. So he pops up again in the 1930s, when I think is it Hamilton who does that documentary Forgotten Men, looking at how 20 years after the Great War, the generation that had fought it was forgotten, and the disabled veterans were ignored and didn't have all the things that they needed. And he interviews a number of men. It's an absolutely brilliant documentary, and I'm pretty sure it's available on YouTube. If not, I'm pretty sure I saw it on one of the kind of download channels. But Piper Laidlaw is in there, and he plays the pipes as part of his interview in that as well. And during the Loos centenary in 2015, at least one, I'm pretty sure 2 or 3 groups of his relatives came over to attend the centenary. and it was quite something, really. So Piper Laidlaw will ever forever be a kind of symbol, really, of the Battle of Loos in 1915. But 1915 wasn't the only year in which Loos saw action. The battle came to an end with the last attack on the 13th of October. The fighting continued for a few days after that. But in 1916, it became a so-called quiet sector. And one of the units that moved into that, for example, was 16th Irish Division. They were also a new army division formed in largely Southern Ireland from largely Southern Irish regiments like the Munster Fusiliers and the Connaught Rangers, and the Dublin Fusiliers, and so on. And they occupied the trenches in front of Hullock and close to Hill 70 for a big chunk of the early part of 1916, and came under a lot of gas attacks. A lot of their men were involved in tunnelling in that area as well, and quite a few of the cemeteries on the ground today have their dead in them. So there's that kind of angle to it. And then in 1917, of course, the Canadians moved into this sector, and in August 1917 was the Battle of Hill 70. And I've spoken in that recent podcast about Loos British Cemetery with Malcolm Vivian, the gunner officer, who I knew, and these are some of his aerial photographs that he had for when his siege guns were operating in the Loos area in 1917. So he could commission the Royal Flying Corps. It sounds like something out of Blackadder. He could commission, send Bob on a dispatch rider's motorbike or whatever to go and get old Blackie to fly up over the trenches and take some photographs. But in reality, this was actually a really well-oiled machine and a really important intelligence gathering system where officers like him could indeed send a dispatch rider to a Royal Flying Corps headquarters near Bethune, request a specific area to be photographed, either directly or oblique, and we can see obliques in these aerial photographs as well, gather intelligence information. They would then use that to register their guns and fire on the targets, and then he could recommission the same pilots to go up and photograph it to see what kind of damage they'd done. So this was a way of the artillery becoming more and more accurate, and led to this ability to fire accurately as the war, more and more accurately as the war went on. And these were kind of some of the many air photographs that he kept as part of his war souvenirs and kind of mirror what was going on. And his unit, one of many British units supporting the Canadian Corps in the attack of August 1917, in a minor operation, but an important one because it saw that point in which command in the Canadian Corps shifted from Julian Byng, who had commanded at Courcelette on the Somme, and then obviously at Vimy Ridge in April 1917. And following the success of that, he was promoted from as a corps commander to an army commander, and Arthur Currie took over as Canadian Corps commander. And this was his first major operation as that commander, and his first battle a few months later at Passchendaele in 1917. In fact, 31st of October today in 1917, the Canadian Corps were pushing hard up the valley from Waterfields and Marsh Bottoms up towards Passchendaele village. Anyway, we're going down one of those many side communication trenches of the Great War. So we've kind of had a look at a bit of the history and the landscape and some of the photographs and the people at Loos, and we'll move on to a bit of the landscape. And it is a landscape still dominated by industry, or the remains of that interest in industry. And this is the famous double crassier taken on one trip when it snowed, made it particularly stand out. And you can go up there. There's a path at the back of it now. It's a communal space. It's a park, and you can take a path up there, gradual path to that flat bit, and have this absolutely fantastic view from the top there over the Loos Battlefield. And on a clear day, you can see the whole thing, and it's a really kind of great place to go to. So in terms of that landscape today, what will we find when we explore it? Well, a good place to start, as always, is Dud Corner Cemetery, which is the main Loos cemetery that sits in the middle of the battlefield, sandwiched between those two tracks, the Loos Road and the Lens Road, close to the Lens Road Redoubt, and a position where there was a lot of dud shells visible, and this is how it became known as Dud Corner. I think there was only one or two burials here actually during the war, and then the 1800 graves that we see here were then subsequently moved in. Of those 1800, nearly 1200 are unidentified. So this is not untypical, where they're searching the battlefields of 1915 and finding remains during the post-war battlefield clearances at a time of the war when soldiers only wore one identity disc. And that meant that when they were killed, and if they were buried, that disc was removed and handed in, and there was nothing on those bodies when they were found after the war to identify who they were. There might be shoulder titles, there might be some divisional insignia, some buttons, an identity of rank or something like that. And you'll see that if you walk these rows, you'll see an unknown soldier of the Gloucestershire Regiment, an unknown sergeant, the Royal Sussex, or whatever it is, but not enough to identify who they were. And that was the great problem, which is why the walls of this cemetery are surrounded by a memorial to the missing, the Loos Memorial. And we're going to come back to that shortly. But this is taken from the viewing platform. You can take some steps to one side of the cemetery and go up onto this platform, which is a unique feature, really, in a British and Commonwealth cemetery from the First World War, to provide a proper platform like this. Tynecott with its big cross of sacrifice with the big steep steps you can go up is kind of a version of it, I guess. But this is a proper platform that you can go up to. And you can have, as you can see, this spectacular view, not just of the cemetery, but of the wider area and the landscape of Loos as it is today. And this is going back to 1930 when the Loos British Cemetery and Memorial were officially unveiled. I think they did two at the same period. Arras was the other one, and this was one of them. You can see this is part of the large crowd of British families and veterans and serving soldiers who were brought along to take part in the commemoration service. And this is a press photograph that I picked up some years ago, which I'm hoping will feature in whenever I get around to finishing off this book on the Forgotten Front. It'll be in there, but this is not quite as well attended as the main gates in 1927 or Chapval a couple of years after this, but nevertheless, many people there. And the Loos Memorial itself, I bought some copies of the registers that came with a few photographs of a guy and some letters. And there was a letter from the Imperial War Graves Commission in there explaining how that they had originally intended to build this memorial in Bethune, but there wasn't enough space in Bethune to build something of this size, and that's how it ended up at Loos. So there's a kind of whole interesting line of discovery there, I think, looking at where some of these memorials were originally intended to be and where they actually ended up. And some years ago, I picked up an Imperial War Graves Commission atlas for about late 1920s, and there's one or two memorials that are marked on there that were never built, so that became parts of other memorials. And Chapval, which we now know is obviously the main Somme memorial, was marked as the Ancre Heights Memorial. So obviously they had kind of a lot of different intentions once. And I still feel that we're still discovering a lot about that element of the way commemoration followed a particular path or didn't, as the case may be, even now, which is a good thing as the War Graves Commission digitise more and more of their archive. Now, when I go to this cemetery with a group, I normally do a little kind of guided walk around the cemetery because there are so many interesting graves to go and have a look at. There's two recipients of the Victoria Cross, and one, of course, that always draws my attention because of my Sussex connections is Harry Wells. Although, you know, here I am broadcasting from Kent, he's actually a Kent lad. He was a Kent police officer. And like a lot of men of that generation, he joined the army for 12 years. That was the standard time. And he normally did what was called 7 and 5, 7 years as a regular soldier, and then 5 years as a reservist. And that meant after 7 years, you could go home and leave the army. You'd be on the reserve, but you could do a normal civilian occupation. In this case, become a police officer. And for many police forces in Britain, the key way in as a police officer was to have served in the regular army. And in some regiments, they allowed you to switch the 7 and 5 so that you did 5 years as a regular soldier and then 7 years on the reserve. Now, his papers don't survive, so I don't know which he did, but he certainly was not serving as a full-time soldier when the war broke out. He was a reservist, and he was recalled to the colours, went over in one of the drafts in August 1914 to join the 2nd Battalion Royal Sussex Regiment. He served with them on the Marne and the Aisne, and in the First Battle of Ypres, and then in the fighting of the offensives of early part of 1915, was promoted to platoon sergeant. And then the attack on the 25th September 1915, of which the painting on the right which I don't have a very good copy of, which used to hang in the mess of the Royal Sussex Regiment, shows him leading his men into action near Le Routoir Farm on the Loos Battlefield. What happened is that all the officers in all of the platoons and companies around him became casualties, and many of those are actually buried in Dud Corner Cemetery nearer to the main entrance. Harry Wells is a bit further towards the back. And he then took over. So a platoon sergeant essentially became the only one with any kind of authority left, and he took over and he led those men into a successful advance on the German positions beyond the Lone Tree, beyond the Routoir Farm, towards Hulloch, with the Northamptonshire Regiment on his flanks. And then across from them, the Gloucesters we spoke about earlier, and those units captured a big chunk of the German line there, and he fell in the capture of that. But there was enough witnesses amongst the wounded officers to recommend him for the Victoria Cross. You needed at least two officers, for example, to recommend a soldier for the VC. And those officers were obviously present, saw him doing this stuff, and he was recommended, and he was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross as a consequence of it. Now, for many, many years, one of the reasons this picture was actually commissioned is there was no known photograph of him. I remember in the 1980s, a book came out called The Register of the Victoria Cross that showed every VC, date of action, date of death, further details, and then a photograph or a painting of the recipient. In most cases, there was a photograph, particularly obviously for the First World War period, but none for him. And the family had kind of disappeared. The location of his Victoria Cross wasn't known. All this kind of stuff. And then in the 90s, sometime this all changed. Somebody found his VC in a drawer. It ended up in the Royal Sussex Regiment collection. And then a researcher went through the Royal Sussex magazines for where the regiment had been in India before the war, and they found a photograph of him in one of the groups. And that finally kind of brought Harry Wells's face out of the past, and he was remembered. And he came from Herne Bay, where he was a police officer, and they named a street there in memory of him as well. And they put one of those centenary plaques to him in Herne Bay as well. So he's very much remembered. Although he's a Royal Sussex soldier, he's got connections as well, and that wasn't unusual really in the kind of history of the regiment at that time. But where he was in action, and where many of the ones that we've already spoken about were in action, is just beyond this, which is the Lone Tree. And to get to this, you have to walk out to this from Le Routoir Farm, down the track towards the high ground, the ridge line between Auchy-les-Mines and Loos, with Hulloch in the distance, where these units went into this vast open ground and suffered a lot of casualties. And the original Lone Tree that was here was a feature on the battlefield that could be seen, this kind of stunted tree that had taken a bit of shell and machine gun fire. And it became a kind of, on an open landscape, it became something that people remembered and looked for. You could kind of see where you were in this landscape that really didn't have a lot of features. And again, Harry Coates, who I mentioned, the veteran of the London Scottish, this is very close to where his unit went over the top. And in that field, just to the right of this track, is where he was gassed going forward. His kind of undying memory of this was moving forward in the kind of fog and the fug of the gas attack. And his gas mask was damaged. He was breathing in some of the gas. He paused at one point to look down at one of his mates who'd been killed, and he saw his stark, dead eyes looking out through the glass eyelets of the PH helmet back at him, and he was told, "Don't stop, push on." But he was coughing and coughing and coughing, and he collapsed, and he was evacuated by stretcher bearers back to the aid post near Le Routoir Farm, and then back to the field ambulance nearer to Bethune, and then eventually to a casualty clearing station at Lillers, and made his way back home for a while. And when he'd recovered from being gassed at Loos, he went for a medical examination, and the medical officer was a bit over diligent, and poor old Harry was coughing his guts up because of the Loos gas still. And the medical officer passed him fit, and he found himself in a draft heading back to the Western Front, and he rejoined the battalion. And his battalion commander kind of looked at him and said, "You're not fit for duty, Coates. I don't understand what you're doing here." He said, "Didn't you take the Pitman typing and shorthand course before the war?" And he said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, you can get off to brigade headquarters. They need somebody who can do that kind of stuff. And it'll only be a temporary post in mind," he said, "but you'll have a bit of respite until you're fully recovered." Well, Harry spent the next 3 years at brigade headquarters, and he saw a lot more of the war than he probably would have done if he'd remained in an infantry platoon, and it probably saved his life in a roundabout kind of way. But he was no kind of shy soldier. He was, by the end of the war, he'd been mentioned dispatches for bravery and awarded the Meritorious Service Medal. But this is where he's kind of war as a infantry soldier on the ground going into action with bayonets fixed. This is where it kind of began, and this is where it ended with that gas that in many places on this part of the front, Robert Graves talks about this. It was the first release of British poison gas in the war, and it blew back onto a lot of the troops, causing more casualties to us than to the enemy. Now, the original lone tree was lost by the end of the war, and there's a chunk of it in the London Scottish Museum in London, of course. And in the 1980s, a group of Western Front Association members planted a tree that was subsequently damaged, and then this is the second one that was planted, which is doing quite well. This is actually taken on the centenary of the Battle of Loos on the 25th September 2015. But I saw it only a few weeks ago, and it's doing well out there in the fields, and it's got a plaque in front of it, and quite a group of people, including local French people, go along and have a ceremony there every year, which is a really good thing. Now, just up the road, close to where that killing zone of the Hohenzollern Redoubt was located, this is where, for me, the battlefield starts to get interesting, because you've got a lot of isolated cemeteries and battlefield cemeteries, of which this one, Quarry Cemetery, located in a quarry, thus its name, is a very, very good example of it. It's got a very different kind of atmosphere and a fascinating cemetery to go to, and the architecture of it is just absolutely quite incredible, really. And you go down into it and you can see the graves, even in this photograph, are scattered, and there's lots of gaps between them. There was a lot of shell fire. It was just behind the British front line. There's a lot of shell fire here. Graves got damaged. Many of the headstones say believed to be or buried near this spot, because the actual original grave marker was lost through shell fire. And again, we kind of, and we're going to mention this a few times, I think, in this talk, the pages of First World War history keep turning. And just before the centenary, they added this headstone to the cemetery of the Honourable Fergus Bowes-Lyon, the late Queen Mother's favourite brother, allegedly, who was killed with the Black Watch in the fighting at the Hohenzollern Redoubt on the 27th of September 1915. And new evidence came to light in around about 2010 to 2012. One of the last Scottish veterans of the Great War had died 4 or 5 years before that. A chap, I'm pretty sure, was called William Anderson, who took part in the Christmas truce in 1914 and then became Fergus Bowes-Lyon's batman. And he gave up information as to where he'd buried his captain, and the family turned up some papers, and the commission accepted that he had once been buried in Quarry Cemetery. So they agreed to place this special memorial to him that reads "buried near this spot." They haven't removed his name from the Loos Memorial, and I suspect they probably won't. I don't think that memorial is coming up for any kind of renovation anytime soon. But it's an interesting thing. And the late Queen, Queen Elizabeth went to visit this grave as part of the Great War centenary in 2014. So again, this is kind of how the pages of the past can reveal information that then leads to changes on the landscape today. And this is a cemetery that places us near to the site of that Hohenzollern Redoubt. Now, I wish I had a drone in the 1980s to be able to get some decent shots of the mine craters that were once here then. When I first used to go here, this landscape was very different to what we see today, which almost became a massive rubbish tip. It was kind of a tip, and there's spoil here now, and it's changed a lot in character. But some of the craters are still there amongst all this scrub. And you can easily find the Hohenzollern Redoubt using linesman or even paper trench maps when you kind of walk the ground today. But I went there one time in the early 90s when they did kind of phase one of what we see today, where they removed about 2 or 3 foot of earth from the whole landscape here. And the amount of First World War archaeology that came up in those days, there was no conflict archaeology, there was no battlefield archaeologists, and this stuff just ended up in skips, rifles, trench shields, I mean, just about anything you can imagine, and a lot of stuff at the deeper level, well preserved. I remember finding bits of the rubberized ground sheets, quite big chunks of rubberized ground sheet, and probably indicating a place where there'd been burials, although I didn't see any human remains during the unearthing of this site at all, and none, as far as I know, were ever declared. And again, it's kind of a different world back then, sadly. But it's a very evocative place, and a place that was a real killing ground. Unit after unit after unit went through here and suffered absolutely terrible casualties. And in the opening stage of the offensive, that 9th Scottish Division, part of the first 100,000, went into action here, and some of its units suffered over 90% casualties in the battle. And its commander, Major General Thesiger, was killed on the second day of the battle when he went forward, where most of his battalion commanders had been killed or wounded. He went forward to see if he could take command himself, and he was never seen again. His name is on the Loos Memorial. He's the most senior officer commemorated on that memorial to the missing. A divisional commander, a man in charge of 20,000 men, disappears into the Hohenzollern Redoubt. And then it became a frontline position for the rest of the war with a lot of mining activity. Alf Rozelle, veteran of the Royal Fusiliers that I've mentioned quite a lot of times on the podcast, he was here with the Royal Fusiliers and in what was called the Battle of the Hohenzollern Craters in March of 1916, when both sides were blowing mines and infantry units were taking the lips of those mines and the craters and things like that. And that kind of toing and froing really went on in this sector for much of the rest of the war. And so there's a lot of evidence of the Great War when you go there today. I found every type of grenade that was ever made by the British and Commonwealth forces on that part of the battlefield. I've not picked them up and taken them home, but I've certainly seen them lying as that one in a field, photograph, don't touch, walk away. There will be farmers that go around and collect this stuff to be put to one side to be collected by the demoneurs, by the bomb disposal squad, but that's not for us to do because this stuff is highly dangerous. And the one in the top right there is a Livens projector. It's a Livens bomb, so it's either got poison gas inside it or liquid flame. And I'm certainly not going to pick it up to try and work out which one. But you've got kind of safer evidence of the Great War. There's a lot of bunkers that were built after the 1915 battle on that bit of ground between the Hohenzollern Redoubt and what were called the quarries near to Hulloch. And that not particularly distinct photograph in the bottom right there shows one of those bunkers, which is almost certainly an observation bunker built to look across that bit of the ground. And in the background, there's a bit of scrub there, which is where there's some mine craters. So it's a fascinating area to walk. Tracks all kind of meet up, and you can walk a big area again with linesmen or paper maps and have a real sense of what this landscape is all about. And again, back to the Hohenzollern Redoubt. We've got the memorials to the 46th North Midland Division, which was one of the key players in the final attack at Loos. They were a North Midland territorial unit made up of battalions, for example, the Sherwood Foresters, the Leicestershire Regiment, the North Staffordshire Regiment, the South Staffordshire Regiment, amongst others. And they went into action at the Hohenzollern Redoubt on that day and again suffered terrible casualties as the Germans threw them back as their attempt crossing no man's land ended in absolute disaster. And there was a very basic memorial on the Hulloch, the Vermelles Hulloch Road, and then just before the centenary, the white stone memorial with the plaques with the regimental badges on that we can see there, that was added much closer to the Hohenzollern Redoubt itself. And I've told this tale, I think, in a previous podcast, but I used to know a chap called Henri who lived near here, who was a retired miner who, after he retired, I think forcibly retired in his case because the mine shut down, he used to walk the fields here. And one day he found a cap badge, and the next day he found another cap badge and a shoulder title, and it kind of went on from there. And he had this staggering collection of this stuff. And when I went to see him the first time, he had it in biscuit tins, and he didn't really even know what half this stuff was. And he tipped it out on the table. And just kind of going through it, I assembled the order of battle of this division, 46th North Midland Division, with the cap badge and shoulder title of every unit, and including every battalion, because the territorial ones would have a big title that would have T7 Notts and Derbies or T6 North Staffordshires and so on. So you could assemble the whole order of battle from what he found. It's just incredible, really. And the stuff that he found over the years there was just staggering. He walked across the field one day and saw what he thought was a pipe sticking out of the ground, metal pipe, and he pulled it out, and it was a Webley service revolver still in its holster, which had preserved most of the weapon, still charged, had rounds in it, 4.55 rounds. He found a German soldier's wallet, and he showed me this. He said, "Open it up and have a look inside." And inside there was a couple of kind of mica negatives from a camera, and you could hold them up. You could just about make out German soldiers sitting in a trench on these things, and it had sat in the ground preserved like that for all those years. Just one of the many kind of incredible private collections that existed on this part of the battlefield and many others across that landscape of the Great War. So, kind of moving behind the British lines a bit, Vermelles Cemetery is an interesting one. On a battlefield itself, captured by the French in 1915, the remains of a chapel from the chateau is there, and the chateau was a dressing station. That's largely how this cemetery began. It's an unusual one because it's separated by a road. Now, in many locations, this would be two separate cemeteries, with Vermelles one side, perhaps Vermelles number one and Vermelles number two on the other side of the road, or Vermelles Communal Cemetery and the other side of the road, Vermelles Communal Cemetery Extension. But this is all one cemetery, but separated by a road. So there aren't many cemeteries which are separated in that kind of way. And the right-hand part of this are the 1915-16 graves, and then the later 17-18 ones are largely in that area on the left-hand side. And it's kind of chronologically ordered because of this, because they buried the first ones basically towards the front near where there was probably a lot of French burials, and then they added some afterwards. And over the years, I've researched so many men. I mean, there's a lot of Sussex lads buried in there. I've got quite a few memorial plaques to men buried in Vermelles Cemetery. It's just one of those that seems to come up. And I remember going, when I lived in South Yorkshire, I went to a medal fair on the Sunday at Wakefield and found a memorial plaque to a soldier of the King's Own Scottish Borders with his photographs and stuff. And then on the Monday, I was in Vermelles Cemetery visiting his grave. And I think, as I've said in that episode on memorial plaques, I think that those plaques are such tangible kind of evidence of a soldier's life and sacrifice. And it's what kind of connects us in many ways to these men buried in these cemeteries and helps personalize, I guess, our visits to them. And then back out on the ground, we've moved out from Vermelles out onto the battlefield again. You've got, as I've said, these small battlefield cemeteries as well. And this is 9th Avenue Cemetery, close to St Mary's ADS, another one, and also close to Bois Carré Military Cemetery. And we're looking towards Vermelles in the distance there, and Mazingarbe and Neuilly-les-Mines in the far distance to the left. This is a very interesting battlefield cemetery because it is a communal comrades grave of men from the Cameron Highlanders who were buried in the plot that is central around this kind of four-sided square of a burial. And so the men are actually not underneath the headstones there. They're in the central plot in several graves, and the headstones are in name order around the edge of it. And I remember reading many years ago, and there's no real source for this, so I mean, who knows? But it is said that these men were laid together, and as they were laid in the grave by their comrades, each one had his arm placed around the shoulder of the other. So they were quite literally comrades locked together in death. Maybe one day if they do a LiDAR scan of that, not that I think they should ever do that, but maybe it will prove it. But I like the idea of it, a comrade cemetery on so many different layers. And it's interesting to kind of see where these men came from. And the scattered graves around it, there are some later graves from the 16th Irish Division in there, and one or two that were subsequently found, I think, when the area was cleared post-war. So I think that the cemeteries here very much kind of give you that reflection of the nature of the fighting and personalize the landscape, act as those beacons to the First World War, and tell us a lot about what was happening on that particular part of the Loos battlefield. But as always, it kind of brings you back to Dud Corner Cemetery and the long walls of the Loos Memorial that commemorates more than 20,000 soldiers who have no known grave. And it's a fantastic kind of memorial laid out. I love the columns and the arches in this. And these are two photographs taken on the same place at two different seasons, one in the winter with snow on the ground, and the other one in the summer with a summer sky above it. And I kind of think they're like portals to another world, to another time, to another place. And they're very much kind of part of the architecture of this, which is, very different and unusual compared to some of the other memorials, and I think gives it a certain amount of power in its own right. But there are so many names on here, and not just men who died in the Battle of Loos in 1915. A very high percentage of those 20,000 men are soldiers who died, and it's dominated by dates like the 25th and the 26th and the 27th of September 1915, which was three of the deadliest days at Loos, in which there were heavy casualties. But for me, going to the Royal Sussex names on here, and this is part of the Royal Sussex panel, there are so many stories that you can tell. Cushion on there, Aylett Cameron Cushion, young second lieutenant, who was commissioned from the Honourable Artillery Company on the 19th of June 1916 and was killed in action at the Boar's Head on the 30th. So he was a platoon commander for 11 days. I mean, the life expectancy of an officer was measured in weeks. There's that fantastic book by John Lewis Stimple called 6 Weeks, which was said to be the average life expectancy of a subaltern, but he lasted 11 days before he was killed. A very short war, and his body never found. He came from Hastings in Sussex. His parents had a tailor's shop there, and no doubt would forever wonder what had happened to their boy who went off to war and never came back. But for some families, it wasn't just one boy at the top left-hand corner there, and we've spoken about them on the podcast and possibly even on here before, when Sarah Nathaniel has been on talking about her work with the War Graves Commission. And these three panel lads all come from Worthing in Sussex. They're all part of the same family. They're all brothers, all killed on the 30th of June 1916, the same day, and their fourth brother taken prisoner. So the panel family had 4 telegrams arrive indicating that 4 sons were missing in action. 3 subsequently proved to would never return, to have been killed in action, and 1 a prisoner of war. Terrible, terrible loss for one family. And there's a name on the bottom left there, Griswood F. Francis Griswood. He was a second lieutenant in the 11th Royal Sussex, a colleague, friend, I would like to think, of Cushion. They served together in the same company, D Company, 11th Royal Sussex. Griswood's brother, elder brother, was the battalion commander, and he was the one, when he was shown the plan for the attack on the Boar's Head, who said he wasn't prepared to sacrifice his battalion as cannon fodder, and they bowler hatted him. They sent him home as a consequence of that. They couldn't accept that a battalion commander could contradict a brigadier and condemn an operation even before it begun. So they sent him home. Griswood remained a bitter man. He lost his brother in the battle. He lost his other brother from pneumonia at Merville earlier that year. And he pushed and pushed to try and get a combat command to return to the Western Front, which he achieved in 1917 when he was sent out to join a battalion of the Manchester Pals and was gassed with them at 3rd Epe during the fighting there. And that ended his war. And they came from Bognor Regis, Bognor as it was then. It wasn't quite Regis at that point. But I tracked the Griswood family down, and I actually lived in a street in Bognor once that they'd once lived in, called the Den, which is where their house was. And his son said that his father was a shadow of his former self after the war, having lost 2 brothers, and forever, ever blaming himself that he didn't do enough to try and help the men, try and save the men, try and stop that attack. But there was, in reality, there was nothing he could do. The attack on the Boar's Head, sadly, was always going to happen, and the outcome was sadly even sadder, was always going to be the same. And of course, if we go back to the Battle of Loos itself, one of the most famous names on the Loos Memorial is John Kipling, a lieutenant of the Irish Guards and the son of Rudyard Kipling, seen in that photograph, another press photograph of the unveiling of the Loos Memorial. That's him circled in red there. That's Rudyard Kipling. You know him as My Boy Jack, although I don't think Kipling ever called him Jack, always John. That poem kind of probably refers to a wider kind of idea of young men. And I remember reading that it may even have been written in response to the death of Jack Cornwall at the Battle of Jutland. I mean, I don't know whether that's true, but certainly what is true is that Kipling was devastated by the loss of his son, left no stone unturned to try and find out what had happened to him. This is the man who wrote the Jungle Book, amongst other things, one of the most famous authors of that time. And he wrote the history of the Irish Guards. I mean, no regiment could have hoped someone like Kipling would write a history like that for them, but he did, because he wanted access to the Irish Guards record so he could find out what had happened to his son, and never was able to really satisfy himself as to his son's fate. And one of the things that he did do following the unveiling of this memorial is pay for a local War Graves Commission gardener to come up to the cemetery at dusk every night and play the last post. standing close to the stone of remembrance by the entrance and facing the graves and playing the last post. And that continued, I thought, up until Kipling's death, but I did pulled some research that I did a while ago, and it seems like it continued beyond his death for a while, possibly up to the outbreak of the Second World War. And it was recorded by some radio stations in the late 1930s in France, but I sadly suspect those recordings probably don't survive. If anyone ever comes across them, I'd love to know about that. And I think that because I mean, I just recorded a little video about this for the Old Front Line, about Kipling and the grave of John Kipling at St Mary's ADS. And is it him? I mean, we could fill another hour or so just talking about that. But again, it's interesting that his name remains firmly here on the Loos Memorial. Kipling spent all that money, including private detectives he hired, to try and find out what had happened to his son. But yet in the 90s, kind of a footnote in a burial record potentially identified a grave that could have been his. I mean, I don't know whether it is him or not. I think there's too much conflicting evidence, and it's a shame that the headstone, just like Fergus Bowes-Lyon's, doesn't say believed to be rather than categorically stating that it's him. But it's an interesting story, and I think one of those classic stories of the First World War, and one I'm going to do a proper video of early next year, following Kipling and his story and John Kipling's story from Sussex through to the Battle of Loos, and look at some of Kipling's work that he did for the War Graves Commission and how he influenced things that we can see in cemeteries even to this day. That's one to keep an eye out for early next year. But with the cemeteries and the memorials and everything else, I would return to the landscape. And I took this on a winter's day, walking with some friends across central part of the Loos Battlefield. And when I took this, the skylarks were high up in the sky above me. It's perfect skylark territory, the Loos Battlefield. There's lots of areas of little scrub. They're ground nesting birds, and there's big open landscapes for them to go high up into that blue and sing their magical song across this landscape and kind of give something of the kind of atmosphere, I think, that we associate with birdsong and the history of the Great War, and what this landscape means to us, more than a century later. And if you've never had a chance to go to Loos before, I hope this tonight might have prompted you to think about that. And if you've not been for a while, go back and walk some of that ground. It's quite incredible. But to kind of bring it up to date and again refer back to how the pages of First World War history keep turning. And these two images are from the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. They're not ones that I took, but they kind of show the progression of this new cemetery that we spoke about in the recent podcast. This is an early one showing how they've already put in the battens that the headstones will go into. So these are the rows of where there will be subsequent burials and where headstones will be placed into these plots. And we can see that there's a fair number of plots there. This is before they built the main entrance and the side entrance from the original cemetery. This is a little bit of a later one where it's the architecture of it is complete and the entrance is complete, and they're still working on the kind of side entrance from the original cemetery. But we can see the intention here. We can see these plots, and the top right-hand corner one is where the initial burials are, which I was speaking about in the podcast. Since I made that podcast, they've buried a few more soldiers who've been found on the Loos Battlefield there. I don't believe that any of those that have been found in this hospital project at Lens have yet been buried, because that is very much ongoing work. The vast majority of them, and I understand it could be hundreds of soldiers that have been found there, the vast majority of them are Canadian by the sound of it, although I believe that they found battlefield burial sites with shell holes burials where there were layers of dead. So there was French and then German and then Canadian on top. And these are on the reverse slope of Hill 70. So they're possibly men that were buried by the Germans and the graves not properly marked, which is why they've remained there for so long. And only when this hospital extension or project has been started that these human remains have been found. And given how good the Canadian records are, and that many of them contain dental records, there's a fair chance that quite a lot of these soldiers will be identified. But I also understand that there is a plan, and this is an unusual aspect of this, if it's true, and obviously I don't really know any more than any of you guys, but this is kind of what I hear, and I'm sure this is something we'll see develop, is that this cemetery will actually be multinational. It won't just be a British and Commonwealth cemetery. It will actually contain the dead from France who've been found as part of these excavations in this area, and it will also contain the dead from Germany. And that is quite an interesting kind of development, if true, is quite an interesting development in the way a British and Commonwealth cemetery will be laid out, because that's not what their original intention was with the creation of these cemeteries, because each nation has its own approach and its own locations to bury and commemorate their dead, and still do. And the French could be taken to Notre Dame de Lorette, and the Germans could be taken to La Targiette, or many other places in far more German cemeteries, actually right up the top part of northern France, than there are further down towards the Somme and Arras, for example. But whether this is going to be a kind of a symbolic thing as the dead of many nations, a bit like the Ring of Remembrance at Notre Dame de Lorette that commemorates all soldiers of all nationalities who died in northern France, whether it's part of that, I don't know. But it's certainly going to be interesting to see how this site develops. And when I went there for the first time, I found it quite moving, actually, if I'm honest with you, in that you kind of look at this empty space and you wonder who one day will be occupying for all time that empty space, and what stories will come out of that, and what tragedies and what pathos and what humor and what families will be touched by this. Because again, it's going back to the idea of women being casualties of the First World War. The families continue to be affected by this, even 110 years after, people are moved to write new epitaphs for new burials. And I think in that respect, the story of these battlefields will be forever, ever progressing, and the pages of the history will forever be turning along that old front line.